Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Have you ever wondered what's really lurking in the shadows? What if it's not just the darkness, but something that has a mind of its own? I never gave it much thought before, but now every corner of my room seems to hide something far more sinister than I could have imagined. It started a few weeks ago, and at first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light. But the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer it became something wasn't right. It all began with my shadow. At first, it was nothing alarming. Just the normal, predictable shadow that follows me around like it always has. But soon enough, I noticed it moving oddly. It was late one night when I first saw it. I turned off the light and, as usual, the shadow disappeared with the flick of the switch. But this time, it didn't simply vanish. It seemed to gather at the edge of the room, pooling underneath my bed. I stood there in the dark, waiting, my breath shallow. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but then, it moved. I froze. The shadow wasn't just resting there. It was shifting, slithering almost as though it had its own purpose. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Was it just a trick of my eyes? Was the darkness playing games with me, or was it something else? Something I didn't want to believe in? I tried to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe the light from the street lamp outside was casting a strange angle. But as the minutes dragged on, the unease grew. My feet felt heavy, unwilling to move. And then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from under the bed. It was subtle at first, like a soft breeze brushing against the floor, but it soon became more pronounced, like something was moving in the dark. My gaze remained fixed on the spot beneath the bed. The rustling continued, slowly growing louder. I could hear the soft scraping sound of something, or someone, shifting beneath the floorboards. My pulse quickened. The room, once so familiar, now felt alien. I backed away, slowly, not taking my eyes off that spot. The shadow wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something was wrong. Something was moving in the darkness, and it had its eyes on me. The next day, I tried to tell myself that it was just an odd occurrence. A fluke. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't ignore what had happened. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach every time I entered my room, and I found myself double-checking the lights before I turned them off, just to make sure the shadow didn't get any ideas. As night fell, the thought of the shadow under my bed gnawed at me. I couldn't bring myself to look beneath it again. What if it was still there, waiting? What if it wasn't just a shadow at all? What if it was something worse? I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, but deep down, a voice kept whispering that I wasn't. Something was coming. Something was already there, waiting. I spent the next few days in a kind of haze, half conscious of everything around me but unwilling to acknowledge the creeping fear that had settled in my chest. I kept thinking about that shadow. No matter what I did, it was always in the back of my mind. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart beating too loudly in the silence. Each time I turned off the light, the shadows seemed to grow, stretching out like tendrils, waiting. The worst part was the quiet. The sounds that usually filled my room, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant murmur of traffic outside, had all faded away. It was as if the house itself had become still, as though it was holding its breath along with me. And then, each night, when I lay there in the dark, I could hear it. The rustling. The faint scratching sound under the bed. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but it became impossible. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there was something in the room with me, waiting for me to let my guard down. And when I did finally fall asleep, it was never for long. I would wake up, heart racing, in the dead of night, and I could feel the air around me thick with tension. Then, one evening, as I was preparing to turn off the light and retreat into the shelter of my blankets, something changed. The air in my room felt heavier than usual, as though the darkness had grown thicker, denser, like it was pressing in from all sides. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a split second, I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where my shadow usually disappeared. It was still there. But now, it was larger. It had spread across the floor, creeping toward the walls, its edges not sharp like they should be, but blurry, like something that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be a shadow or something more. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. My mouth went dry. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper. It came from under the bed. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The whisper came again, a slow, guttural murmur, as if the shadow itself was speaking to me. My heart was hammering in my chest now, my entire body frozen in terror. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that spot under the bed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadow began to move. It was no longer content to stay in one place. It shifted, like something alive, crawling toward me, inch by inch. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The whisper grew louder. It sounded like my name, but distorted, like it was being dragged through water. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door, throwing it open and slamming it behind me, but even as I stood there, breathing heavily, the feeling didn't leave. I could still feel the presence in that room, waiting. I was convinced that whatever it was, it knew I had left, and that it was waiting for me to return. The next morning, I went back into the room, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The sun was up, and the room didn't look as threatening in the light, but I knew the shadow was still there. I glanced under the bed. It was empty. At least, it seemed that way. But something inside me told me that the worst wasn't over. The shadow had never truly left. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight, lurking in the corners of my mind. My thoughts constantly returned to that whisper under the bed. It sounded so real, so personal, like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me to hear it. I started avoiding my room. I slept on the couch, using any excuse to stay out of there as much as possible. But no matter where I went, I felt it. That oppressive weight in the air, that sense of being followed, watched. It crept into my thoughts while I was alone, in the silence of the night when the house seemed to hold its breath. One evening, I made the mistake of going back into my room to retrieve something I'd left there. I tried to convince myself it was fine, that I was just being foolish. But the second I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. It felt colder, the air thicker. The shadow under the bed was still there, waiting, stretching farther across the floor. This time, it didn't retreat when the lights flickered out. It seemed to grow stronger, darker, like it was feeding on the darkness itself. I could hear the whisper again. It wasn't the soft murmur before, it was louder now, clearer. My name, drawn out like a soft hiss. I didn't dare look under the bed again, but I felt the pull. The compulsion to look, to see what was there, to face whatever it was that had been watching me all this time. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, and the moment my fingers brushed the switch, the whisper stopped. Silence. My hand hovered above the light, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of something in the room, something watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I hesitated, unable to bring myself to turn on the light. It felt like if I did, the moment would be lost, and whatever was under that bed would finally come for me. But then, the silence was broken by a soft sound, an unmistakable scrape. Something, or someone, was moving beneath the bed. I stepped back, the fear growing in my chest like a balloon ready to burst. I wasn't alone. It wasn't just my shadow anymore. It was something else. Something that had taken shape. The air around me seemed to crackle with tension. My throat tightened, and I could hardly breathe. I reached out with trembling fingers and flicked the light on. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the lamp, the shadows no longer threatening. But then, I saw it. The shadow, no longer just a shape on the floor, was rising, slowly, like it was stretching its limbs, slowly forming into something human. I gasped. The shape under the bed was no longer just a shadow. It was a figure, a dark silhouette that seemed to shift and writhe in the light, as if it couldn't quite hold its form. It was crouched there, its outline jagged and distorted. The shadows twisted around it, like the darkness itself was feeding it, strengthening it. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive. And it was coming for me. I bolted toward the door, but my legs felt heavy, like they were trapped in a nightmare. The figure under the bed stretched upward, its limbs elongating unnaturally, its body rising in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was tall now, taller than any human should be. I could hear the scraping sound again, louder this time, as its limbs scraped against the floor, dragging itself toward me. I reached the door and yanked it open, my heart racing in my chest, but before I could escape, the door slammed shut with an impossibly loud bang. I was trapped. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air closing in as the figure moved toward me, its shadow now filling the entire space. I could feel its presence in every corner of the room, pressing in, suffocating me. And then, I heard it again, its voice, louder now, clearer. "Come back," it whispered. "Come back to me." I stumbled backward, my mind racing for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in. The figure loomed over me, its face a blur of shadows, its hands reaching out, its fingers elongated and sharp. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow was no longer just a part of the room. It was the room. And it was waiting for me to make the final step. I could feel it now, the truth of it, whatever it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to leave until it had me. Until I became a part of it. "Come back," the whisper echoed in my ears, growing louder until it was the only sound in the world. The shadows began to close in around me. And in that moment, I realized that there was no escaping it. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, the figure looming closer, its form now almost tangible in the suffocating darkness. The air felt thick, as though every breath I took made it harder to breathe. My mind raced, trying to process the nightmare unfolding in front of me, but all I could do was watch as the shadow stretched, its fingers reaching out like tendrils. I could feel it, its presence surrounding me, pulling at the very fabric of my being. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was something that had taken root in my world, something that existed in the space between what I understood and what I feared. The whisper was now a constant murmur in my head, a voice I couldn't escape. Come back. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order, a demand. And I could feel myself being drawn into it, like the shadows themselves were claiming me, pulling me into their depths. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs were locked in place, my body refusing to obey, my mind consumed by the sheer horror of the figure before me. It was so close now that I could feel its cold breath, if it had breath at all, rushing against my skin. My hands trembled as I tried to reach for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with the same sickening rhythm as the shadow that towered above me. And then, in a split second, something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it have me. I didn't know how much longer I could stand the suffocating weight of its presence, but I knew that if I didn't move now, it would be too late. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced myself to turn and run. I wasn't thinking anymore, just reacting, my mind screaming for escape. My legs moved without thought, my feet stumbling against the floor as I darted toward the window. But just as I reached it, a cold, icy hand, no, not a hand, but a mass of shadows, grabbed my ankle. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the suffocating air around me. The shadow yanked me back, pulling me toward the center of the room, where its form had become a mass of writhing darkness. It was everywhere, wrapping around me, suffocating me. Come back, the voice hissed again, this time directly in my ear, as though the shadow itself had crawled inside my mind. Panic surged through me. I kicked, I clawed at the air, but it was like fighting against the very darkness itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All that was left was the overwhelming presence of the shadow, pulling me deeper, closer to it. And then, a thought, no, a realization, hit me like a bolt of lightning. I had to stop fighting. I had to stop running. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just some supernatural entity that wanted to consume me. It was a part of me. It had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, to understand it. The whisper wasn't just a voice from the darkness, it was my own voice, calling to me from the depths of my own fear, my own mind. Somehow, deep down, I knew that this thing wasn't just some outside force. It was something I had created, something I had let into my life without realizing it. It was a reflection of everything I had tried to push down, the isolation, the loneliness, the dread. It had fed on my fear, on my unwillingness to face it. And now, it was time to face it. With a final surge of will, I stopped struggling. I let the shadow take me. But instead of giving into the overwhelming darkness, I focused. I turned my thoughts inward, trying to connect with whatever part of myself had given rise to this thing. I had to confront it. I had to see it for what it was. The room around me grew colder, darker still, but this time I didn't look away. I stared into the depths of the shadow, not as a victim, but as someone who was finally ready to understand. For a moment, everything stopped. The whisper faded. The pressure on my chest lifted, and I felt calm. It was as if the shadow had stopped trying to drag me down, as though it had accepted that I was no longer afraid of it. But just as quickly, everything shifted. The shadow writhed and twisted, its form contorting violently. It was angry now, furious at being faced, at being challenged. The whisper turned into a scream, sharp, raw, desperate. But I didn't flinch. I didn't close my eyes. I held my ground. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the room fell silent. The shadow was gone. I was alone. The silence in the room was deafening. The air that had once felt thick and oppressive now seemed oddly light. I looked around, my heart still racing, but the room was just a room again. My bed, the walls, the window, all familiar, all unchanged. I didn't know if it was over. I didn't know if the shadow was truly gone or if it was simply waiting for me to lower my guard. But one thing was certain, I had faced it. I had confronted it, and for the first time, I understood. The shadow wasn't just something outside of me. It was a part of me. And no matter where I went, I would always have to keep an eye on it. Because the darkness, it would always find a way to creep back. The days after that night were strangely quiet. The shadow had disappeared, leaving behind only a faint unease that lingered like an aftertaste. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the worst was behind me. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the memory of the darkness remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting for the right moment to return. I returned to my room, slowly, hesitantly. The place where it all began felt different now, but not in a comforting way. It was as if the walls still held the echoes of the terror I had experienced, the cold air that had once pressed against me. My eyes instinctively went to the spot under the bed, and for a moment I wondered if the shadow was still hiding there, just out of sight. But there was nothing. The room was empty. I thought I had won. I thought I had faced my fear, confronted the darkness within me. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped it. Was the shadow gone, or had it simply retreated into the depths of my subconscious, waiting for the right time to return? That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought about everything that had happened. The whispers, the cold touch, the way the shadow had moved, alive, as if it had a mind of its own. The fear that had gripped me in those moments had been all-consuming. But now, as I lay there, I wondered if I could ever really escape it. The sound of the clock ticking in the silence was deafening. My eyes flickered closed, but just as sleep was about to claim me, I heard it. A faint rustling. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than a ticking clock. I listened, straining against the quiet. It came again, softer this time, like a movement under the bed, too subtle to be sure of. I turned my head, slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, the shadows long and stretched across the walls. I tried to reassure myself. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The shadow was gone. But then, I saw it. A flicker. The shadow beneath the bed, a shape forming, slowly, gradually, as though it were stretching itself awake. I could see it now, its outline, dark and jagged, twisting like something that didn't belong. I could feel it, the same pull, the same pressure I had felt before. It wasn't the same as it had been, but it was still there. Still waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening again. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. The whisper came again, soft but clear, like a breath against my ear. Come back. It was my own voice, distorted, broken. My own fear. my own dread. The shadow was speaking to me, calling me back into the darkness. I could feel my hands trembling, my body frozen in place. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thicker. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to get out. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow, from the thing that had once been a part of me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared. For a moment, the room was still. The air, once heavy with the weight of fear, felt empty again. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know if I had imagined it, if it had all been in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. The shadow hadn't gone. It had never left. It was always there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to tell myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that I had faced my fears, that it was over. But deep down, I knew the truth. The shadow would always be there. It would never truly leave me. Because it wasn't just something outside of me. It was a part of who I was. A part of my darkness, my fear, my loneliness. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it would always find a way to return. The only thing I could do now was live with it. Live with the knowledge that, no matter where I went, no matter what I did, the shadow would always be waiting. Under the bed. In the corner of my mind. And when the lights went out, I would hear it. The whisper. Come back. The darkness had never truly been defeated. And it never would be. I never believed in ghosts. I always thought they were stories people told to explain the unexplainable, a way to give meaning to the things that didn't quite make sense. But after moving into this apartment, I began to wonder if maybe there was more to the strange noises I had been hearing than I cared to admit. It started out small, just a faint sound in the dead of night, like someone whispering in the next room. I convinced myself it was nothing more than the building settling or the wind, but the longer I stayed, the more I realized it wasn't just my imagination. At first, I thought it was the neighbors. Maybe their walls were thin, or maybe they liked to talk late into the night. But then the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, it was a conversation, a low murmur that seemed to be about me. The words were indistinct, as if they were careful not to be overheard, but the tone was unmistakable. They were arguing. Why is he here? One voice asked. He doesn't belong, another voice replied. I lay in bed, wide awake, my heart racing. Who was talking? Who were these voices, and why were they in my apartment? I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things. I had just moved in. Maybe it was the stress, the change, the loneliness. But then the footsteps started. They weren't normal footsteps, though. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. I could hear them clearly, moving around the apartment, from one room to the next, pacing like someone who had nowhere else to go. I told myself it was the building, that it was old, that the pipes were making noises. But there was something about those footsteps, something too rhythmic, too purposeful. I was alone. I lived alone. So who was walking in my apartment? One night, after another long day of hearing nothing but the whispers and the steps, I decided I had had enough. I wasn't going to sit in that apartment, listening to things that didn't make sense. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking through the rooms. I checked every corner, every closet, every room. But nothing was out of place. The apartment was empty. Or so it seemed. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sight. Dust covered the floor in the living room, and there, in the middle of the room, were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. I stared at them, frozen. There were no other explanations. The floors were old, and I had swept them the day before. There was no way that dust could have settled so perfectly, so distinctly, if I had walked through it. The footprints were clear, imprinted into the dust, leading from the door to the center of the room. And the strangest thing of all, there were only 2 sets. I was living alone, but someone, or something, had walked through my apartment. I felt the walls close in on me. The sound of my breathing grew louder in my ears, as if the very air around me had changed. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't. I needed to understand. The voices, the footsteps, the footprints, they were all tied together. They weren't random. Whoever, or whatever, was in my apartment, they were trying to tell me something. But what? As the days passed, the situation only got worse. The whispers didn't just come at night anymore, they followed me, drifting into the corners of my thoughts. Sometimes I would hear them while I was awake, as if they were coming from behind me or in the next room, just out of reach. Every night, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they felt like they were right beside me. And the shadows. I started seeing them too. Out of the corner of my eye, in the reflections of the windows, there would be shapes moving in the darkness, just beyond my vision. When I would turn to look, they were gone. But I knew they were there. I could feel them watching me, waiting. I was losing my grip on reality. I had to find out what was happening, who was in my apartment, and why. One evening, as the sun began to set, I noticed something different. The air in the apartment felt heavier, as though it was charged with electricity. The whispers were louder tonight, almost audible, but I couldn't make out the words. My heartbeat quickened, and I was on edge, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that I wasn't alone. And then it came. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Slowly. But no one was there. I could feel the temperature drop, and I immediately reached for the light switch, but when I turned it on, I froze. On the floor, in front of me, was a trail of footprints. They were clear, and they led from the door to the center of the room, just like the ones I had seen before. But this time, they were fresh. And they were wet. Something was in my apartment, and it wasn't going to stop until I understood what it wanted. The voices were louder now, and they were no longer whispers. They were clear, demanding. He can't stay here. He's not one of us. Get rid of him. And I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't just hearing things. I wasn't alone. They were here. And they weren't leaving. The apartment felt smaller now. Even though I was technically still alone, it no longer felt like it was just mine. It felt crowded, as if there were unseen people moving around me, watching me from the corners of my eyes. After finding the footprints that morning, I had tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the shadows, the whispers, were just figments of my imagination, stress, exhaustion, the loneliness that comes with moving to a new place. But every time I walked through the apartment, the atmosphere felt thicker, heavier, like something unseen was pressing on me, urging me to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was changing, that it wasn't just a space that was shifting, but something else, something far darker. That night, I decided to stay awake. I was determined to see if the whispers would return, to understand if they were real or just part of the anxiety that had been creeping into my thoughts. I sat in my armchair by the window, staring out at the street below. The city was quiet, but in the silence of my apartment, I could hear my heart beating in my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the building made me jump. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid. Around midnight, I heard it again. A faint rustling coming from the hallway. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It was as if someone was moving through the darkened rooms, knowing exactly where to go. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to stand up and check. The apartment was eerily quiet. The light from the hallway flickered faintly through the cracks in the doorframe, casting long shadows on the walls. I stepped into the hallway, the floor creaking under my weight. I moved cautiously toward the kitchen, then the living room, checking every corner. Nothing was out of place. There were no people, no signs of movement. I thought I had imagined it. But then I saw it. A dark smudge on the floor, something small, something strange. It looked like dust, or maybe dirt. I bent down to get a closer look. The smudge, it was a footprint. A fresh one. My blood ran cold. I hadn't made it. I hadn't walked in here. And there was no one else in the apartment. So where had it come from? I stood there for a long moment, staring at the footprint, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. My first instinct was to run, to grab my things and leave this place. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was fear. But I couldn't leave without knowing. I followed the trail. The footprint led from the hallway to the bedroom door. It was faint, but I could see it clearly in the dim light. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I hesitated. What if I opened it and found something I couldn't explain? What if I found the source of the voices, the footsteps, the things that I could never fully understand? I forced myself to open the door. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of the bed, the dresser, the old wooden furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I took a step into the room, I felt a cold breeze sharp against my skin, like a draft from somewhere unseen. It was coming from under the bed. I crouched down, shining my flashlight toward the dark space beneath the bed. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. But then, there it was. A shadow moving. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The shadow had disappeared. My heart raced. I backed away from the bed, trying to stay calm, but the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. Suddenly, I heard the voices again. This time, they weren't whispers. They were louder, clearer, and they seemed to be coming from the walls, from behind the very structure of the apartment. "He's here," one voice said. "He shouldn't be here," another one responded. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if they were real, if they were echoes of my own fear, or if something more sinister was happening. But I couldn't deny it. The voices were real. And they were speaking about me. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I turned toward the door, but before I could leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The dust on the floor, the footprints, they weren't gone. They were moving. The dust shifted, forming new tracks in the light of my flashlight, as though someone, or something, was walking through the apartment right now. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, swirling and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The air grew colder, heavier. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "They're not supposed to know," one voice hissed. "It's too late," another voice answered. I could feel their eyes on me, even though there was no one there. I could feel the space closing in on me, as if the apartment itself were watching, waiting, judging me. With a rush of adrenaline, I ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. And whatever was here, whatever had been in this apartment long before me, wasn't going to let me go without a fight. I didn't sleep that night, or the next night, or the one after that. Every time I tried to close my eyes, the voices returned, louder, clearer, pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear them behind the walls, in the corners of the room, sometimes even directly in my ear. "They won't leave," one voice whispered. "They can't leave." "I told you," another voice replied. "He's part of us now." I tried everything to escape them. I moved furniture, rearranged the rooms, even opened all the windows to let in fresh air, as if I could cleanse the place of whatever presence haunted it. But nothing worked. The voices kept coming, louder each time, as if the apartment was amplifying them, feeding off my fear. The most terrifying part wasn't the voices, though. It was the silence between them. The moments when the apartment seemed to hold its breath, when everything felt still, and I couldn't tell if it was all in my mind or if the world around me was waiting for something to happen. Every night, the air grew colder. I would wake up shivering, my body soaked in sweat, though the windows were closed. The darkness felt different, as if it had weight, like it was pressing against me from all sides, trying to suffocate me. But it wasn't the cold that frightened me the most. It was the realization that I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. I couldn't even tell if I was truly alone in the apartment. I'd hear someone walking behind me while I was alone in the kitchen. A shadow would flicker out of the corner of my eye, just barely visible. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was I hearing things that weren't there? Was the isolation getting to me? The apartment was old, and the building creaked and groaned. The pipes could make strange sounds. But these were not ordinary sounds. They were deliberate, purposeful. They were voices. They were footsteps. One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided I had to do something. I had to find out the truth. I couldn't go on like this, driven to the edge of insanity by a presence I couldn't understand. I went to the building's superintendent, an elderly man who had lived there for as long as I could remember. He was a quiet, unremarkable person, the kind of man who didn't speak much, but knew everything about the building. "Is there something wrong with this apartment?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady. The superintendent paused, as if considering my question carefully. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "Some things are better left unknown," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice even further. "This building has seen things that can't be explained. People come and go, but not everyone leaves." His words were cryptic, and I didn't fully understand what he was trying to tell me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something more, something he wasn't saying. The next night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed answers, and if the superintendent wouldn't give them to me, I would have to find them myself. I waited until midnight, when the building was silent and the city below had settled into darkness. With a flashlight in hand, I made my way down to the basement of the building. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew, but there was something else, something heavier in the air. A sense of foreboding. I walked slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to find the source of the voices, the source of the footsteps, the thing that had been haunting me since I moved in. At the far end of the basement, there was a small, forgotten storage room. It was locked, but the lock looked old, rusted. It hadn't been used in years, perhaps decades. I stood in front of the door, my breath coming fast, unsure of what I might find. But I knew I couldn't stop now. I used a metal rod I found nearby to pry the lock open. It took several tries, but eventually the door gave way with a loud creak. Inside, it was dark, too dark. I couldn't see anything at first. But then, as my flashlight swept across the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the far corner, was an old, wooden chest. It looked out of place, dusty, untouched for years. But it was what was around it that caught my attention. The floor was covered in markings, symbols, scrawled hastily into the wood. Some looked like they had been burned into the surface, while others appeared to be etched into the walls. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hands. There was something in the air, something oppressive, and the temperature dropped another few degrees. The whispers started again. Only this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the chest. "You shouldn't have opened it," one voice whispered. "It's too late," another one replied, as if mocking me. My heart was pounding now, my body frozen in place. I tried to back away, but something compelled me to open the chest. It was as though the apartment itself had a hold on me, drawing me deeper into its dark secrets. I slowly lifted the lid. The smell of decay hit me first, something musty and old, like forgotten memories. Inside, there was nothing but old papers, yellowed with age, and a few faded photographs. But as I rifled through the contents, something caught my eye. A small, torn piece of paper with a name written on it. My name. I dropped the paper as if it burned me. I was standing in the basement of an apartment building, surrounded by ancient markings and photographs, with the knowledge that the apartment I called home wasn't mine at all. The whispers grew louder, and for the first time, I understood. The apartment didn't want me here. It was never my home. It had always been waiting for someone like me to arrive. And now that I had, there was no way out. The whispers were louder now, so loud they felt like a storm, a thundering wave crashing over me, vibrating through my bones. The apartment, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive, breathing, pulling me deeper into its dark grasp. I could feel its weight bearing down on me, the pressure in my chest growing with every passing second. I had to get out of that basement. But my legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place, as if the building itself was holding me there, forcing me to face the truth. I couldn't look away from the chest. From the name on that piece of paper. My name. It didn't make sense. How could my name be in a place like this, in a chest filled with ancient papers and symbols? What was it doing here? The air seemed to thicken, the shadows in the basement growing longer, creeping toward me. I stumbled backward, desperate to leave, but the moment I turned to run, I felt something tug at my sleeve. A cold, invisible hand. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The voices changed. "They can't leave," a voice murmured, barely a whisper, but it felt like it came from right beside me. They belonged to us now. I backed up against the wall, my heart racing, the flashlight flickering in my trembling hand. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was here, whatever had been here long before me, it didn't want me to leave. I had to get out. Now. I bolted up the stairs, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness in front of me. Each step felt like it was dragging me back down, each creak of the floorboards under my feet pulling me closer to the basement, to the chest, to the thing that had been waiting for me. I reached the top of the stairs and rushed through the hallway, my breath shallow and ragged. The apartment door was just ahead, the promise of escape so close I could almost taste it. But when I reached for the doorknob, I felt it. The air was still. The apartment, my apartment, was silent. The whispers were gone. I stood there, holding the doorknob, frozen. Something was wrong. The silence felt wrong. The stillness suffocating. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence, the weight of it, pressing down on me. I turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I pulled harder, desperation taking over, but the door wouldn't open. Panic started to rise in my chest. What was happening? Why couldn't I get out? And then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't have to look to know they weren't my own. The floorboards creaked, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving toward me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the hallway, but there was no one there. But then I saw it. The shadows. They were moving, stretching, growing, curling like tendrils around the walls. They were no longer just shadows. They were shapes, figures, shifting and morphing into something else. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The shadows took form. A figure appeared before me, tall and thin, with features that were hard to make out, as if it was made of darkness itself. Its face was a blur, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed. The figure moved closer, its shadowy form flowing like smoke, its presence overwhelming. "You should have left," the voice echoed, but it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, all of them speaking in unison. "Now you're ours." The shadows twisted around me, squeezing, pressing against my skin. I could feel the coldness of it, the chill creeping into my bones. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the air growing thin. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The shadows withdrew, the air returned to normal, and I was left standing there in the middle of the hallway, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It was gone. But it wasn't. I turned, desperately trying the door again, and this time it opened. I didn't wait for a second longer. I ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get out of that apartment, out of that building. I raced down the stairs, through the front door, and into the night air, my lungs burning from the cold. The city streets were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, lurking just out of sight. I didn't stop until I was a few blocks away, breathless, my body shaking uncontrollably. I collapsed onto a bench, my hands gripping the edges of it like a lifeline. I had survived. But I wasn't free. Because I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in that apartment, whatever had been watching me, hadn't left. It was still out there. And it was waiting. I didn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, felt the pressure on my chest, heard the whispers in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape it. The apartment was no longer just a place. It had become a part of me. A nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I moved into a small motel, hoping to find some peace. I thought being away from the building would help, that maybe the presence would fade if I wasn't there to feed it. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me like an echo of what had happened, haunting my thoughts, tormenting me in the quiet moments when I least expected it. At night, I would hear the sound of footsteps outside my room, slow and deliberate, just like before. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, the noise of the wind. But I knew better now. The apartment hadn't let me go. It was still out there, still waiting, still following me. One night, the whispering voices became clearer than ever. "You can't run forever," they said. "You belong to us." I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to confront it, face whatever was waiting for me. I packed my things, my heart pounding in my chest, and took a cab back to the building. The city was quiet, the streets empty, as if the world was holding its breath along with me. The building looked different now. Darker. Heavier. As though it recognized me, as though it had been waiting for me to return. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I didn't hesitate. I had to end it. I had to find out the truth, once and for all. I walked through the door, the air thick with the same oppressive weight I had felt before. Everything was silent. But I knew it wasn't truly silent. The apartment was alive with something that was watching me, waiting. I went back to the basement. This time, there were no distractions, no hesitation. I knew what I had to do. The chest was still there, in the same place, the same forgotten corner. But now, it seemed even more menacing, like it was pulling me in. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. The whispers returned, louder than ever. They were no longer distant voices. They were right behind me, in my ear, almost suffocating. "You came back," they hissed. "Now you're ours." With a shaking breath, I opened the chest. This time, I wasn't afraid. The same papers were inside, the same photographs. But something was different. There, at the very bottom, was a small wooden box. I had never seen it before. It was unmarked, worn with age, but somehow familiar. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the smooth surface. As soon as my hand made contact, a searing pain shot through my chest, like an invisible force had gripped my heart. I staggered backward, gasping for breath. The room spun around me, and I collapsed to my knees, clutching the box to my chest. And then, everything stopped. The pain, the whispers, the pressure, all of it vanished. It was gone. I opened my eyes, unsure of what had just happened. The basement was still the same, the chest still open before me. But the box, it was gone. I was holding nothing. I stood up, confused, disoriented. I wasn't sure what had just occurred, but I knew one thing: I had to leave. I stumbled up the stairs, my mind in a haze, my body moving on autopilot. I needed to get out. I needed to escape whatever had just happened, whatever had taken that box from me. I reached the door and yanked it open. Outside, the air was cold. The city was still quiet. But there was something different now. A feeling that everything had shifted, like a piece of the world had moved and left something behind. I walked into the street, my feet moving without thought, my mind numb. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't the whispering I had heard before. It wasn't the voices from the apartment. It was my own. "I'm not leaving," I heard myself say. I froze. I hadn't spoken. I hadn't said anything. But there it was again. "I'm not leaving," my voice repeated, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me. The voice was mine, but it didn't sound like me. It was distant, distorted, as if something had taken over my very soul. The world tilted, and I stumbled back. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows were still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, creeping closer with each passing second. They hadn't left. They had always been with me. And now they had control. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide. Because the apartment, the building, the voices, they weren't just memories. They weren't just echoes of something that had happened. They were me. And I had become one of them. Have you ever woken up in a place that was familiar, but somehow felt wrong? Like everything you once knew had been altered overnight? This morning, I woke up to that feeling. I opened my eyes, but something was off. Something in the air felt different. I blinked and looked around my room. Everything seemed just as it always had been, the worn-out rug, the cracked window, the stack of books beside my bed. But when I got out of bed and looked out the window, that's when I noticed it. The streets below, empty. Completely empty. No cars, no people, not a single soul. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must still be asleep. But no, I was awake. I could feel my heart starting to race, my breath growing shallow. I stepped back from the window and paced the room. Maybe it was just a strange moment, some sort of coincidence. But no, it didn't feel like that. I grabbed my jacket, opened the door, and stepped outside. The silence hit me first. It was overwhelming. It was too quiet, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Normally, I would hear the hum of the city, cars, people talking, the faint rumble of distant buses. But now, it was as if I had stepped into a vacuum, a place suspended in time. I walked cautiously down the street, glancing into the windows of houses, shops, and apartments. Every place was dark and empty. No lights, no movement. I thought I might hear a dog barking or a distant voice, but there was nothing. Just the eerie stillness pressing in around me. I turned a corner, hoping to find some sign of life, but the street continued to be deserted. The occasional breeze stirred the papers along the sidewalk, sending them fluttering into the air like ghosts. Then I felt it. A strange sensation on the back of my neck. As if something, was watching me. I paused, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease, but it was there, like an invisible presence trailing behind me. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the street was still empty. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself that it was just my imagination. The wind picked up, and the empty streets seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to focus on the sound of my footsteps, but even those felt muffled, as if the world was swallowing them up. That's when I saw it. Movement. Not in front of me, but in the corner of my eye, to my left. A shadow. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, the abandoned buildings, the silence. I kept walking, my mind racing. Was I losing my mind? Was I the last person left in the city? Or was there something else here with me, something I couldn't see? The feeling didn't go away. The presence. It was there, just beyond my vision. Every time I glanced over my shoulder or turned a corner, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, a blur, too quick to focus on. I picked up the pace, but no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers of movement were growing louder, more insistent. Someone, or something, was following me, staying just out of reach. Every time I looked, it vanished. I rounded another corner and froze. In the distance, at the end of the street, there was a figure. Tall, dark, standing completely still. My breath caught in my throat. It was watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, as though it were waiting for me to make the next move. I took a step forward, my legs shaking. What was I supposed to do? Should I run? Should I call out? But as I moved, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, like a statue. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It was as if the very air had swallowed it up, leaving no trace behind. I felt dizzy, disoriented, and once again, the feeling of being watched returned, even stronger than before. I started walking again, my footsteps growing faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. Why had it disappeared? Where had it gone? Then I saw another figure. This time, it was closer, standing at the end of the alley to my right. I could feel its presence before I even saw it. And just like the first, it vanished the moment I blinked. I didn't know how long I had been walking or how far I had gone. Time seemed to warp, stretch, and collapse all around me. The more I moved, the more I felt trapped in this city, this empty shell of a place where no one was left except for me and whatever was following me. The sky had begun to darken, and with it, the city seemed to grow even quieter. It was as if the very air was closing in, suffocating me with its silence. And then, as I reached the edge of the city, I heard it. A soft voice. Faint, like a whisper on the wind. You can't leave. I froze. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from anyone in particular. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing in my mind. I turned around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. Only the empty streets. I took a deep breath and kept walking. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. And I wasn't going to be able to leave. Not ever. I didn't sleep that night. The city was still empty, and the words "you can't leave" lingered in my mind, echoing in the silence like a cold whisper. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was the product of my fear and confusion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found myself walking the same streets again, hoping for some sign of life, anything to prove that I wasn't completely alone. But as I rounded corner after corner, the city remained unchanged, silent, abandoned, as if the world had simply forgotten about it. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement, something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, a flicker, always just on the edge of my vision. I would turn quickly, but by the time I focused on the spot, it was always gone. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was always there, just behind me, like a presence I couldn't shake. I decided to head towards the center of the city, hoping to find something familiar, something that could explain what was happening. As I walked, I noticed that the buildings, though mostly intact, had an eerie stillness to them. The windows were all shut, and the doors were locked, as if everyone had left in a hurry, as if the city had been abandoned overnight. I passed the park, where children's swings creaked in the wind, swaying gently despite the lack of people. It was almost too much to bear. The city felt like a ghost town, a place where life had once existed but had now been erased. I turned into the main square. I used to come here often, the hustle and bustle of the marketplace, the sound of vendors shouting, the smell of fresh bread walking through the air. But now it was just silence. The fountain in the center of the square was still running, water trickling down from its stone spouts. But there was no one to enjoy it, no one to admire the intricate carvings on its base. The sound of the water was almost too loud, as though it was mocking me, reminding me that I was the only one here. Then, as I stood there, staring at the empty square, I felt it again, the sensation that I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, heart pounding, expecting to see a figure, but once again, there was nothing. The square was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the pavement cracking beneath my feet as I walked. Then, something caught my attention, something odd. There, at the base of the fountain, were footprints. Fresh ones. The marks in the dirt were still visible, but there was no one around. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the ground. The prints were small, almost delicate, as though someone had been standing right here, just moments ago. But I hadn't seen anyone. No one had passed by. I stood up quickly, my heart racing in my chest. It was impossible. There was no one left in the city. I was alone. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. I backed away from the fountain, suddenly feeling suffocated by the silence. That's when I heard it again, a soft whisper, so faint I almost thought I had imagined it. Come closer. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was something dark about it, something that made my skin crawl. I turned in the direction it came from, but once again, there was nothing. No figure, no person, just empty space. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that I wasn't truly alone. And then, I saw it, across the square, standing by one of the old buildings, a shadow. Not just a shadow, but a figure. Tall and thin, its edges blurred, as if it didn't quite belong to this world. I froze, staring at it. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the figure was drawing me in, like it was calling me closer, pulling me toward it with an invisible force. The figure shifted, taking a step forward. And then another. It didn't walk. It glided. Slowly, silently, as if it were floating above the ground. I snapped out of my trance and turned, running as fast as I could. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted through the empty streets. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there, not with that thing following me. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was still there, moving faster now, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance between us. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, feel its gaze on my back. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose it, but as I reached the end, I found myself standing in front of a dead-end wall. There was nowhere left to run. I turned around, chest heaving with panic, but the figure was gone. Vanished, as though it had never been there at all. I waited, trembling, expecting it to reappear at any moment. But the alley was empty. The city was silent once more. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, and stumbled back into the street. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled. What was happening? Why was I being followed? And what was that thing? The answers seemed just out of reach, like a dream I couldn't quite remember. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone. And whatever it was that was watching me, it wasn't human. And I had no idea how to escape it. I didn't dare stop running. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I pushed myself forward, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The city seemed to stretch on forever, the streets all blending together as I ran, desperate for some kind of shelter, something to shield me from whatever was lurking out there. I found myself outside a small convenience store, one I had visited 100 times before, but now it felt like a forgotten relic of a life that no longer existed. The windows were dark, and the door was ajar, a small gap that led into the shadows of the interior. I hesitated, glancing back down the street. No sign of the figure. No movement. No sound. For a moment, I thought I might be safe, that maybe whatever it was had lost track of me. But that feeling of being watched never went away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill crawled up my spine. I could feel it. It was out there, waiting, just beyond my vision. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The store was dark, the only light coming from a flickering overhead bulb. The shelves were barren, as though the store had been ransacked long ago. There was no sign of life, no clerk, no customer, nothing but the lingering emptiness. I moved cautiously, stepping between the aisles, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. The floor creaked under my weight, the sound magnifying in the otherwise still air. As I passed the back aisle, I heard something. A soft scrape against the floor, like something, or someone, was moving. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. Nothing. I took another step, trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm myself. But then I heard it again. A scrape, followed by a faint rustling noise. I turned quickly, scanning the dimly lit aisles for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Only the shelves, the empty space, and the silence. I felt the familiar presence again. That suffocating feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from just beyond the edge of my vision. My pulse quickened, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't alone. It was here. I moved toward the counter, hoping to find some sort of weapon, something to defend myself with. My hands shook as I pushed open the cabinet doors beneath the counter, searching through the drawers, finding only empty wrappers and discarded papers. I turned around quickly, eyes darting from one corner of the store to the next. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on me. That's why I saw it. At the far end of the store, just past the shelves of canned goods, there was a figure. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. It was standing in the darkness, its form barely visible in the low light. But I knew it was there. I could feel its eyes on me. My body went rigid. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. It was the same figure from before. The shadow I had seen in the square. The one that had followed me through the streets. It didn't move, but it was watching me, waiting. Its presence filled the room like a suffocating fog, pressing in from every direction. I stepped backwards slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my mouth dry. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, like it was biding its time. I turned and bolted toward the door, my legs burning with the effort to run faster, to escape. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. The door was no longer ajar. It was shut. Locked. I tugged at the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me, and I slammed my shoulder against the door, trying to force it open. It didn't move. I could feel it behind me, that sense of being watched, the pressure of the figure's gaze. I turned around slowly, my mind screaming for me to stop, to run, but my body refused to listen. It was closer now. I could see it more clearly, its shape, its height, the way it moved, or rather didn't move, as if it were more a presence than a physical being. Its form was blurry, its edges shifting, as if it couldn't decide whether to be real or not. The air grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs. The store felt smaller, the walls pressing in from all sides. I looked around desperately for anything at all, that could help me. But the shelves were bare. The walls were empty. There was nothing here but me and that thing. It was closer now, standing at the end of the aisle, its thin figure towering over me. I could feel the weight of its stare, the emptiness it exuded. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I took a step back, my feet dragging, my body trembling. The space between us shrank, and I felt the air grow thick with something else, something more terrifying than silence. It was the feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. Something I couldn't stop. The figure moved, gliding closer with unnatural ease, its limbs stretching toward me, reaching for me. I slammed my fist against the door once more, then again. I didn't care if my hand bled. I needed to escape. Finally, with one last, desperate shove, the door gave way. It creaked open, and I tumbled out into the street. But when I looked back, the store was gone. The building, the shelves, the figure, all of it had vanished, as though it had never existed at all. The city was empty again. Silent. And I was alone. The street felt endless, stretching out before me like a dark, twisted labyrinth. The familiar buildings, the quiet hum of life that had once filled the city, were gone. Now, everything was muted, distant, as though the world had been drained of color and sound. I staggered forward, not sure where I was going. My thoughts were foggy, the adrenaline from my escape leaving me shaky and disoriented. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was resisting me. But then I heard something. At first, it was just a whisper, faint and distant, like the wind rustling through the trees. But then it grew louder, clearer. Footsteps. I froze. I knew that sound. I had heard it before, back in the store, in the alleyways. Someone was walking behind me. No, not someone. Something. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. Nothing. There was no one there. The street was empty, just like it had been when I stepped outside the store. But I could still feel it. That presence. It was there, lingering in the air, watching from the shadows. I tried to calm myself, to think logically. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the empty city, the fear, it was all starting to take its toll. I had to keep moving. But my feet wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, closing in. I picked up my pace, but the footsteps kept pace with me, always just out of view. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but empty streets stretching on forever. I ran faster, ignoring the stitch in my side, the breath coming in sharp gasps. The city seemed to narrow around me, the walls of buildings pressing in like an invisible force. There was nowhere to hide. No escape. Then I saw something ahead. A doorway, half hidden in the shadows of a crumbling building. It looked like an old warehouse or a storage unit, the door slightly ajar. I didn't think. I just ran toward it. The moment I reached the door, I pushed it open and stumbled inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. I pressed myself against the cold, damp wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, everything was still. I listened. The footsteps had stopped. I couldn't hear anything anymore. But the silence, it was deafening. The air felt thick with tension, suffocating. I dared to breathe a little easier, but the feeling of being watched hadn't faded. I was alone in the dark, but I could still feel it. That presence, lurking just out of sight. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. A soft, breathless sound. It was my name. I turned sharply, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was no one. The room was empty. The shadows were deep, stretching across the floor like fingers. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside my head now, echoing. "Why are you running?" the voice asked. It was soft, yet unmistakable. It didn't sound human. "Where are you going?" it continued. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the space growing smaller with each breath I took. My heart raced as I turned toward the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The room had changed. The walls were now covered in something, thick, dark marks, as though the very air had been stained. The floor was covered in dust, but there were footprints. Footprints that weren't mine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. But there was no escape. There was nowhere left to go. I turned again, and this time I saw it. The figure. It was standing in the doorway. Its tall, thin form barely visible in the dim light. The edges of its body shimmered and wavered as though it was more shadow than flesh. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move. And then, in a voice so cold it cut through the silence like ice, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I couldn't understand. Couldn't process it. What did it want from me? Why was it following me? The figure took a step forward, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, as if it was both too close and too far away at the same time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't respond. The air around me seemed to freeze, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty once more. I didn't know if I had imagined it, if I was losing my mind. But I didn't care. I had to leave. I had to get out of this city, away from whatever this was. I ran. But as I stepped back onto the street, I realized that nothing had changed. The city was still empty, still silent, still watching. I didn't know what was real anymore, but I couldn't stop running. I didn't know how long I had been running. Time had lost all meaning. The street stretched endlessly, like an infinite loop, but I couldn't stop. My legs burned with exhaustion, my chest tight with fear, yet I kept moving. The city around me felt increasingly unreal. It was too quiet, too still. The hum of life was a distant memory, a fantasy I couldn't grasp anymore. I was alone. Alone, but not truly. There was something out there, watching, waiting. It followed me, lurking just beyond my vision, like a shadow in my peripheral sight. I couldn't trust myself anymore. Was I imagining it? Was the voice, the figure, all in my head? I didn't know. I turned another corner, my heart racing. The streets seemed identical, like a maze that offered no way out. But then, ahead of me, I saw something different, a light. A soft glow spilling from a building. My mind barely registered the relief, the possibility of finding something, someone. I had to check it out. I hurried toward it, my breath ragged. As I drew closer, I realized it was an old diner, one I used to pass by every day when life was still normal. Its neon sign flickered weakly, buzzing faintly in the stillness. I pushed the door open, the sound of the bell above it breaking the unnatural silence. Inside, it was just as I remembered, but wrong. The tables were neatly set, the floor spotless, the booths undisturbed. It looked like it could have been right out of a postcard from a time before all this. But no one was there. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. I glanced around, expecting to see a familiar face, someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Only shadows, stretching long and unnerving under the dim light. Then, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my pulse leaping in my throat. The room had darkened, the light from the neon sign outside casting eerie reflections on the walls. The shadows were deeper now, darker, as if they were closing in. And then I heard it, the whisper again. It was louder now, clearer. "Why are you here?" I froze. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but I saw nothing. No one. "Why did you come?" the voice continued, now louder and more distinct. It was coming from all around me, like it was inside my head. I couldn't think. I couldn't speak. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw them. Figures, standing in the corners of the diner, just beyond the light's reach. Their shapes were tall, thin, unnatural. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel their stare, cold and judging. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no words came. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, the voice spoke again. This time, it wasn't a question. "You're not alone here." I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and the figures were moving now, slowly, impossibly slow, like they were made of smoke or shadow. They drifted toward me, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid. I staggered back, my mind racing. What were they? What was happening to me? Was I losing my grip on reality? The figures closed in, their faces still hidden, but I could feel them. I could feel their presence, like cold fingers pressing against my skin. I had to leave. But there was nowhere to go. As if in response to my thoughts, The door behind me slammed shut once more, trapping me inside. I turned, desperately pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room was spinning, the air growing thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in the silence. "Leave us." The voice was sharp now, demanding, but still distant. I could feel its power. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. Something ancient, something dangerous. I backed away from the figures, panic rising in my chest. I had to escape. I had to get out. But no matter which direction I turned, they were there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And then, one of them stepped forward. It was closer now, its form more solid, less shadow. Its face. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it watching me, scrutinizing me. It raised a hand, a long, skeletal finger pointing straight at me. "You should never have come here," it whispered. "You should have stayed away." I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream at it, to tell it I had no choice. But the words wouldn't come. The figure reached out, and as it did, I felt the temperature drop. The air became cold, freezing. My breath formed clouds of frost in the air, and my fingers began to tremble uncontrollably. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The room seemed to stretch, the walls warping, bending, as if reality itself was starting to crack. I could feel the world around me crumbling, the edges of everything blurring. "Run." The voice was no longer distant. It was right behind me. I turned, bolting for the door again. My hand grasped the handle, and this time it gave way. I burst outside into the night air, gasping for breath. The city stretched before me, still empty, still silent. But the figures, they were there. In the distance. Watching. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know what was coming for me. But one thing was certain. I wasn't alone. And whatever it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone? That suffocating sensation when every creak of the floor, every shift in the shadows, sends a chill down your spine, yet when you turn around, no one is there? That's how it started. It was late at night when I first noticed my dog acting strange. Bella, a small but fiercely loyal terrier, had never been the type to bark at nothing. But every night for a week, she would sit in the corner of my living room, her ears perked, eyes fixed on a single point in the empty space by the window. She'd stare at that spot for what seemed like hours, growling low in her throat, her hair standing on end. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe there was a mouse, a flickering light, or something outside that caught her attention. But when it happened again and again, I started to wonder if something else was going on. I decided to stay up one night, determined to see what she was reacting to. As the clock struck midnight, the house was silent. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Bella was still, her eyes fixed on that same corner of the room. Her growl was barely audible, just a quiet rumble, but I could feel it in my chest, vibrating with tension. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching her watch the empty space. My eyes began to play tricks on me, shadows seemed to shift, shapes appeared, and then vanished, only to leave behind an eerie stillness. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But Bella didn't stop. She kept staring, her gaze unwavering, her growl deepening. Then, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a soft whisper that didn't belong. I froze, straining to listen. The whispering seemed to come from the corner Bella was fixated on, though there was nothing there. The hairs on my neck stood up. I knew I had to do something, but what? I felt trapped, as if I were being drawn into something I couldn't escape. I got up and grabbed my phone, hoping to distract myself, maybe record something, anything. As I held the phone in my hand, I decided to take a photo of the corner where Bella was staring. I didn't expect anything to show up, but I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The camera flash went off with a quiet pop, and for a moment, the room was lit up. I checked the picture, ready to dismiss it, but my heart dropped. There, in the corner, seated directly across from me, was a shadowy figure. It was faint, barely visible, but it was unmistakably there, sitting with its back straight, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. There was no mistaking the fact that it was not a trick of the light. It was too distinct, too real. I blinked and looked again. The figure was gone. The corner was empty. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What had I just seen? I couldn't understand it. I zoomed in on the photo, my finger trembling. The figure was still there, but as soon as I focused, it seemed to blur again, like smoke fading into the air. Bella whimpered, her eyes locked on the same spot, her tail tucked between her legs. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in my mind, sitting silently, watching. The next morning, I rushed to work, trying to push it all out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo again, the figure in the corner. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. That night, the barking started again. Bella's growl pierced the silence of the house, louder this time. She was more frantic, her body trembling, her teeth bared. I could feel the tension in the room, the air heavy with something unseen, something waiting. I grabbed my camera again, my hands shaking. The corner was empty. But this time, something was different. A figure, barely perceptible, was standing, hovering, just at the edge of my vision. It wasn't sitting this time. It was standing, watching, waiting. I snapped another picture, desperate to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. When I looked at the photo, I saw it clearly. The figure was closer now, almost halfway between the corner and where I stood. I zoomed in, and the more I looked, the more details became visible. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but distorted. The face was a blur, like it had been smeared out of existence. Its body was long and thin, its arms too long, and the shadows around it seemed to cling to it, like it was part of the darkness itself. I couldn't breathe. I turned around, hoping it was all a nightmare. But the air felt colder now, and Bella's growl turned into a deep, guttural bark. I was no longer alone. And whatever it was getting closer. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. The figure inched forward with each passing second, its presence undeniable. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the floor, my body refusing to obey. Then it spoke. A voice, barely above a whisper, but clear in my mind. Why did you come? It was a question, but not one that demanded an answer. I didn't know what to do. It was real. It was here. And it wasn't leaving. The days after that night blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. I couldn't escape the thought of that figure or the unsettling feeling that had taken hold of me. The voice it spoke wasn't just in my head, it had a weight, an echo that lingered in the room long after it had vanished. The air around me always felt heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides, urging me to acknowledge what I had seen or what I hadn't seen. I couldn't bring myself to look at the photo again. Every time I thought about it, my mind raced back to that moment, the moment I first saw it, sitting quietly, watching. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was imagining things, but the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight, refused to leave. And Bella had grown more agitated every night. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep. She only growled and barked, her eyes always fixed on that same corner of the room. But something had changed. She wasn't barking at nothing anymore. It was like she was reacting to something that I couldn't perceive. She would follow the figure's movements with her eyes as it silently drifted around the room, and her barking became frantic, as if she were trying to warn me. One night, as I sat on the couch, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, I heard a soft sound, a light tapping, almost like fingernails on wood. I stopped breathing. The sound came from the corner where the figure had first appeared. I slowly turned my head to look, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest. The tapping continued, rhythmic, like a signal. But when I stood up to investigate, Bella froze. Her eyes widened in terror as she looked up at me. The tapping stopped. And then I heard it, the sound of something heavy shifting behind me, something that had been hiding in plain sight. I spun around, but again, nothing was there. My pulse raced, and I fought to steady my breath. I tried to reason with myself. It had to be the house settling, a draft, something. But the unease gnawed at my insides, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my camera, determined to prove to myself that I was losing my mind. If I could capture what was happening, maybe then I could make sense of it. Maybe then I could rid myself of the paranoia, the constant gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood at the edge of the living room, my fingers trembling as I lifted the camera. I pointed at the corner where the figure had appeared before, and clicked. The flash lit up the room, but the instant the light faded, I felt it. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I could feel its presence. It was close, so close, in fact, that my skin prickled with a cold I couldn't shake off. I lowered the camera, my eyes scanning the empty space in front of me. But no figure appeared. No shadows twisted into a human shape. It was as though whatever it was had decided to disappear again, retreating into the darkness. My fingers shook as I stared at the photo I had just taken. At first, I didn't see anything. It was just the corner of the room, lit up by the flash. But as I zoomed in, I felt my stomach drop. There, right in the middle of the shot, was a distortion. A blur. It was faint at first, like a shadow trying to blend into the darkness behind it, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was the figure, its outline, barely visible, like smoke swirling around the edges of the frame. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. Bella whimpered from the doorway, her eyes fixed on the photo, her body trembling. I felt sick, like the ground beneath me was shifting. My eyes couldn't leave the photo. The figure was there, it was real. But how? How was it possible? I'd been alone in the room. No one could have entered without me hearing them. A quiet whisper broke my trance. It was faint, like a breeze brushing through the room, but it made my blood run cold. Stay with me. The voice wasn't in my head this time. It came from the corner. I could feel it, feel the weight of it in the room with me. My breath hitched, my body frozen in place. I dared not move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure's presence was growing stronger, filling the space around me like a dark cloud, suffocating and oppressive. The voice continued, slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring each word. Why are you so afraid? I'm not going to hurt you. But I didn't believe it. I couldn't. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't speaking to comfort me. It was speaking to manipulate, to control. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more paranoid than the last. I looked around, but the room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as though the space itself was becoming part of the entity's grasp. The silence between each word stretched longer, and with every passing second, I could feel the figure's presence growing stronger. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there, trapped in its gaze, waiting for it to make the next move. I turned and ran. I didn't even look back. The only sound that followed me was the soft patting of Bella's paws behind me, urging me forward. But even as I bolted into the safety of the hallway, I could still feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, its presence lingering in the shadows, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. I had no idea how long I would be able to outrun it. And worst of all, I didn't know if it was following me, or if it had already found its way inside. I spent the rest of the night pacing the hallway, my mind reeling with the horrifying realization that whatever was in my house wasn't going to let me escape so easily. I locked the door to the living room and sat in the dim light of the hallway, not daring to turn on any more lights. The silence was unbearable, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Bella had gone quiet, but I could tell she wasn't asleep. Every now and then, I could hear the soft patting of her paws as she moved cautiously across the floor. Her presence was a small comfort in the suffocating tension of the room, but even she seemed unsettled, her once loyal and protective nature now clouded with fear. The camera lay on the floor beside me, the photo still displayed on its screen. I hadn't dared to look at it again, afraid that the figure might reveal itself more clearly, as if it were trying to communicate. But I couldn't stop myself. The need to understand, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, was too strong. I picked up the camera again, the cold plastic feeling like a weight in my hands. I stared at the photo, the blurry, indistinct shape in the corner, and I zoomed in. The distortion seemed to pulse, almost alive, flickering between the light and the shadow. It didn't make sense. There was no way that a shadow should behave like this, not without some outside force. The figures seemed to sway, moving in ways that defied any logic I knew. I took a deep breath and turned the camera back on. If it had been a trick of the light, I would have seen it by now. But no, this wasn't a trick. This was something far more disturbing. I had caught a glimpse of the thing that had been watching me for who knew how long. And yet, something about it felt wrong. The longer I stared at the photo, the more it seemed like the figure in the corner was trying to reach out, as if the image itself was bending toward me. My stomach lurched. The whisper returned, soft but distinct, like the echo of a voice from a distant room. Come back. I froze. The voice was too close, too clear this time. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was as if the figure were speaking directly into my mind. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. Bella growled low in her throat, her eyes darting nervously to the living room door. She could sense it too, I realized. Whatever this was, it wasn't something we could just run from. It was already here, and it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I grabbed the keys from the table and headed for the front door. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, it would be too late. But just as my hand reached for the doorknob, I heard it. The softest sound, almost imperceptible, the unmistakable creak of the floorboard behind me. I whirled around, my pulse in my throat. Bella's growl intensified. She was fixated on something in the living room, her body rigid with fear. I didn't see it at first, no figure, no movement, but I felt it. The air shifted, heavier now, almost electric. A cold breeze swept through the hallway, though every window in the house was shut tight. I stepped back, heart racing, my eyes scanning the darkened doorway of the living room. Then, just as I was about to call out to Bella, a faint movement caught my eye, a shadow, a shape, standing still at the far edge of the room, almost blending into the dark. It wasn't as subtle as before. It wasn't in the corner anymore, it was standing right in the middle of the room, facing me. I couldn't make out any details. It was as though the shadows themselves had formed into a silhouette, a distortion of light and darkness. But I knew what it was. The figure wasn't just watching me now, it was waiting. My throat went dry. My entire body felt frozen in place, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I had no choice. I grabbed Bella, pulling her close as I backed away from the door. She whimpered, sensing the danger, but her fur bristled with an instinct I couldn't ignore. The air grew colder with every passing second, and the figure remained unmoving. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. My blood ran cold. Each step it took was silent, almost too quiet to hear, but I felt the weight of its presence with every inch it closed toward me. And then, the whisper again. "Stay with me." The words were clearer now, more defined, like they were coming from inside my mind. The figure was no longer a vague shadow. It was something real, something that I couldn't explain, something that was part of this house. I turned and bolted for the door, Bella right behind me, her paws scrambling against the floor as we ran. My hand fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic surged through me. The house seemed to constrict, like it was trapping us inside. And then I heard it. A faint sound, like a voice, but not one that I could place. It was a soft hum, almost melodic, and it made my skin crawl. I tried again to open the door, my heart racing, but it wouldn't open. The figure was getting closer, I could feel it, and I couldn't outrun it. The room was filled with the sound of the humming now, and I couldn't escape it. I was trapped. The door still wouldn't open. My fingers, slick with sweat, struggled to twist the handle, but it was like the lock had fused with the wood. Every second, the air around me seemed to thicken. I could feel the pressure building, suffocating me. Bella barked furiously, her growls intensifying as she moved to the edge of the room, her body rigid with tension. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse racing. The figure, if you could even call it that, was now much closer. It was no longer a vague shape in the darkness. It had a presence, a shape, a form. I wanted to scream, but the air seemed to constrict my throat, as if the room itself was trying to swallow me whole. "Come back." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. A pull, like it was tugging at the very core of my being. I shoved my shoulder into the door again, but it still wouldn't budge. My breath was ragged now, my chest tightening with panic. I could hear the floor creaking beneath the figure's weight as it moved closer. Each step echoed, too heavy, too deliberate. Bella was almost frantic now, her barking a desperate warning. But the figure wasn't stopping. It was relentless. I backed away, stumbling toward the hallway, the cold wind swirling around me as if the house itself was exhaling its final breath. The shadows in the living room seemed to ripple and distort, like they were alive, stretching toward me. I looked at Bella, her eyes wide with fear, and then back at the figure, which had almost reached the threshold of the living room. I was running out of options. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I rushed through the narrow hallway. Bella followed close behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond my reach, something just out of sight, but always there, always watching. The faint hum echoed through the walls, and the coldness pressed against me, filling my lungs with a chill I couldn't shake. I reached the stairs. The house felt impossibly large now, every creak, every groan of the floorboards amplified. The stairs led to the second floor, and I knew there was no other way out of the house. The back door, the windows, they were all locked. I had to go up. I had to try to get to the attic, to get away from whatever was following me. But as I stepped onto the first step, a sudden sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a soft scuffling noise, like something shifting across the floor behind me. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat. The hallway was empty. The living room was empty. Yet that sound, slow, purposeful, was growing louder. Bella let out a low, fearful growl. Her eyes locked onto the corner of the hallway where the darkness seemed to gather. There was something in the shadows. I could feel it, just out of sight, like a presence that was there but not there. Something that was never supposed to be. I backed up slowly, moving closer to the stairs, my breath shallow and quick. The scuffling noise continued, but now there was another sound mingled with it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against a surface. It was coming from the living room. It was moving, following me. The tapping grew faster, louder. It wasn't just one set of fingers. There was a second and a third, tapping, 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 all around me, as if there were multiple sources of sound circling closer and closer. My mind raced. I couldn't think straight. My feet were frozen in place, caught between the stairs and the living room. The air was so thick I could hardly breathe. And then, through the silence, the voice again. Clearer this time, as if it was right beside me. Stay. The command hit me like a physical blow. I felt the words crawling up my spine, pushing me back, pulling me toward the figure. My body wanted to move, wanted to run, but it was as though the house had gripped me with invisible hands, binding me in place. I shook my head, trying to fight it, but I couldn't. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape, but I felt something deeper inside, something primal, telling me that if I moved, I might never make it out alive. And then I saw it. Just beyond the corner of the living room, a shadow moved. A figure emerged from the darkness, standing in the center of the room. It wasn't human. The shape was twisted, unnatural, like the shadows themselves had coalesced into a form, a shape too grotesque for the light to touch. It was long, stretched out of proportion, its features indistinct, like something that could only exist in the spaces between spaces. I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my eyes from it. It was calling to me, but not with words. No, it was beckoning me with its very presence, with the way it moved. The tapping continued, now joined by soft, with dragging sounds, like something crawling toward me, inch by inch. The air grew colder still, and my body shuddered with a deep, instinctual fear. It was here. But I couldn't run anymore. I was too scared to move, too paralyzed by the sight of it, by the feeling of its gaze pressing down on me. And then the voice, no longer a whisper, no longer a command, spoke again. Stay with me forever. The words made my blood run cold. And in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just here to watch me. It was here to take me. I couldn't breathe. The words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Stay with me forever. The voice reverberated in my skull, its tone now an inescapable command. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the very house was pressing against me, weighing me down, pushing me toward the thing that now stood motionless in the living room. I tried to move, tried to turn toward the stairs, but my feet felt like lead. The fear, the suffocating terror, had rooted me in place. Bella's frantic barking from behind me seemed distant, muffled, as though the walls themselves were absorbing every sound. The darkness around me grew thicker, more oppressive, as if it were swallowing the light in the house piece by piece. The figure in the living room twitched. A subtle movement, like a slow, creeping crawl, but enough to send a shiver through my spine. It wasn't just standing anymore, it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, staring straight through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to block out the sight of it. I had to move. I had to escape. But the paralysis was overwhelming. Every inch of me screamed for movement, but it was as though I was trapped in my own body. The sound of dragging grew louder, closer, but it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the hallway. I dared to open my eyes, just a crack, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving against the grain of the light, gliding along the floor. A long, twisted hand, pale and unnatural, slid along the floor, fingertips dragging across the wood, leaving behind a trail of cold. It wasn't the figure that had made the sound, it was something else. Something else was in the house, crawling closer, inching toward me. I heard Bella growl, a low, guttural sound, and then she barked again, louder, more frantic than ever. But the noise wasn't enough. Not enough to drown out the tapping, the dragging, the sound of something unseen inching ever closer. I could feel the house shift. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the floor beneath my feet growing unstable. I staggered backward, my legs barely able to hold me. My breathing was shallow, erratic, each breath burning in my chest. Stay with me, the voice whispered again, this time from behind me. It was like it was right in my ear, breathing with me, as though it had been there the whole time. I spun around, finally forcing my legs to move. I ran, but my feet felt as if they were stuck in tar, every step dragging me down. The sound of the dragging, closer now, followed me, faster, like it was gaining on me. The stairs. I reached the bottom of the stairs, but the figure was already there, blocking the way. It was no longer a vague shape, it was something tangible. Something real. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had substance, a twisted form that seemed to stretch and distort with each step it took. The air grew colder, thicker, until it was hard to breathe. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. Panic surged through me like a wave. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Please, I begged, my voice trembling, barely a whisper. Please, leave me alone. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took another slow, deliberate step forward, the floor groaning beneath its weight. Its presence filled the room, smothering me. I could feel it all around me, its coldness, its darkness, pressing in, closing off any escape. And then I heard it, the creak of the floorboards upstairs. Slow. Steady. One step after another. It was moving. The shadow. The unseen thing. It was coming down the stairs. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it take me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced my legs to move, dragging my body forward through the hallway toward the front door. But the door wouldn't open. I yanked the handle with all my strength, but it was stuck, locked, like the house was refusing to let me leave. The sound of dragging was louder now, almost deafening. It was right behind me. I could feel it. Its cold, unnatural presence closing in. Bella barked once more, her voice distant, but strong. She was somewhere, but I couldn't focus on her now. I couldn't focus on anything except the figure that was now inches from me. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. I could see it, or at least, I could sense it. It was real. Solid. A twisted nightmare standing before me, reaching out with long, pale fingers that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. And then, in that instant, I realized there was no escape. The house had become a prison, and I was the prey. The figure moved toward me, its hand outstretched. My breath caught in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't move. The room around me darkened, the walls closing in, the light vanishing, until there was nothing left but the cold, dark void that surrounded me. Then, in the deepest silence, I felt it, a gentle, almost tender touch on my arm. And everything went black. I remember the day I bought the clock like it was yesterday. The antique shop was hidden away on a narrow street I'd never noticed before, tucked between two old brick buildings that seemed to have stories of their own. I had been wandering aimlessly that afternoon, a bit lost in thought, when I saw the sign that caught my eye. Curiosities and wonders, everything has a story. I had always been intrigued by oddities, things that had a history or a strange aura around them. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, the musty scent of old wood and dust enveloping me. The shop was cluttered, shelves crammed with trinkets, old books, paintings, and items that seemed to whisper of their former lives. The old man behind the counter looked up from his book. His face was wrinkled, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting me. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice raspy but kind. I nodded, but I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers brushing against the objects on the shelves. Some of them were beautiful, others strange and unsettling, but one thing caught my attention, a clock. It was unlike any clock I had ever seen. Its frame was tarnished silver, and the face was an intricate design of swirling patterns, almost like a spider's web. But it wasn't the design that made me pause. It was the hands. Unlike normal clocks, this one's hands turned in reverse. They moved counterclockwise, slowly, as if defying time itself. I couldn't explain why, but something about the clock drew me in. Maybe it was the mystery, the strange allure of the unknown, but I knew in that moment that I had to have it. "How much?" I asked, turning to the old man. He looked at the clock for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "That one's not for sale, son," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "It's special. You should leave it be." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Special? How could a clock be special? But the thought of walking away, of leaving it behind, filled me with an inexplicable unease. "I'll take it," I said, my voice more determined than I had intended. The old man sighed, his gaze lingering on me. "You're sure?" he asked, a strange warning in his eyes. I nodded. I wasn't sure why, but I felt as though I was meant to have it. He didn't say anything more as he wrapped the clock carefully in paper and handed it to me. As I left the shop, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The air outside felt cooler, and the world seemed quieter somehow, as if something had shifted. At home, I placed the clock on the mantel in my living room. The ticking sound was faint but constant, an almost hypnotic rhythm. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The hands, which had been moving slowly when I first brought the clock inside, seemed to be speeding up. They were moving in reverse, yes, but now they seemed almost eager, as though they had somewhere to be. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the clock. After all, it was old, maybe it was just broken in some strange way. But then, as the night went on, I began to notice things. Small things at first, like the way the light seemed to shift in the room. I couldn't quite explain it, but it was as if the shadows were moving in ways they shouldn't. I glanced at the clock again, its hands moving steadily backward. Then I noticed something else. I had been sitting at my desk, reading, when I saw a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. It was fleeting, but it was there, something out of place. I stood up, heart pounding, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered. A sense of being watched. A creeping unease that settled over me like a cold fog. I looked back at the clock. The hands were still moving, the time moving backward. That's when I realized something was happening. Something was changing. The world outside seemed different, more distant, as if I were seeing it through a foggy lens. I had no idea what was going on, but the more I watched the clock, the more I felt as though time itself was slipping away from me. I tried to ignore it, to go about my night as if everything was normal. But as the hours passed, I began to feel off. A strange sensation filled the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled backward, as if time was unraveling around me. The clock continued to tick in reverse, its hands sweeping backward with a slow, deliberate motion. But now, it wasn't just the clock that was moving backward. The world around me seemed to be following its lead. I looked at the clock again, the hands now moving more rapidly. And that's when I saw it, the reflection in the window. I wasn't alone. The reflection in the window wasn't mine. It was something else. A shadow. A form standing behind me, just out of reach, as though waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, but when I spun around, the room was empty. The reflection was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was the strange atmosphere of the clock or the odd way the room seemed to bend and shift around me. I wasn't sure. I looked at the clock again, its hands spinning in reverse, its tick-tick-tick echoing in the room like a quiet warning. I tried to ignore it. I went back to my chair, trying to focus on my book, but the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in on me. I looked at the clock once more. The time was moving backward, but I couldn't make sense of it. I stood up, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape from the oppressive atmosphere in the room. But as I moved toward the door, something stopped me. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. But then it grew clearer, louder, more insistent. "Don't go," it whispered. My skin crawled. I froze, staring at the door, unable to move. The whisper continued, now almost like a low hum in my ears. I didn't know what it was, whether it was the clock or something else entirely, but it was there, lingering in the space between my thoughts. I stumbled backward, colliding with the table. The clock's ticking was deafening now, almost as though it were counting down. I looked at the face again. The hands had stopped moving for a moment, frozen in place, but only for a brief second. Then they started moving again, faster this time, with a disturbing intensity. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp. The walls stretched and shrank, and the air turned thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The clock was still ticking, its hands spinning furiously backward. And then, without warning, everything changed. I was no longer in my living room. The world had shifted around me. The familiar sights of my home had disappeared, replaced by an unfamiliar landscape. The walls had crumbled, leaving nothing but ruins. The floor beneath my feet was cracked, and the ceiling had fallen away, revealing a sky swirling with dark, chaotic clouds. I stumbled forward, disoriented, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this real? Or had I slipped into some kind of dream? As I looked around, I saw movement in the shadows. Figures. Shadows of people, but they weren't quite people. They were distorted, shifting shapes, flickering in and out of existence. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The clock's ticking was louder now, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. I clutched my head, trying to make sense of it all, but the confusion and panic were overwhelming. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. And then I saw it again, the figure. The one from the reflection. It was standing in the distance, watching me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its form shifting as it came closer. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. It was like the clock was pulling me toward it. Every tick, every turn of the hands seemed to drag me deeper into this twisted version of reality. I could feel the air thickening, pressing in on me from all sides. The figure was almost upon me now, and I could hear its breath, a low, raspy sound like something from a nightmare. And then it spoke. "Time is not your ally," it said, its voice like a crackling whisper in the air. "You cannot escape what you've already set in motion." I felt a chill run down my spine. My eyes widened in terror. What did it mean? What had I done? The figure reached out, its hand brushing against my arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of panic through my veins. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The room, the world, everything seemed to close in on me. The clock's ticking grew faster, louder, until it was all I could hear. Time was running backward, unraveling everything, and I was caught in its pull. The figure's face was now clear, and I saw it, those eyes, hollow and dark, staring back at me with an unnatural hunger. "You should have left it alone," it whispered, its lips curling into a twisted smile. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me was collapsing, warping, and I was powerless to stop it. And then everything went dark. I awoke with a start, gasping for air, my heart racing. I was back in my living room, the same as before. The clock was still ticking, its hands moving in reverse, but everything else was eerily quiet. My body trembled, and I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me. Was it a dream? Had it all been a nightmare? I slowly stood up, my legs unsteady. The room felt wrong, as though it had been distorted, but everything appeared normal, too normal. The furniture was in place, the window was open just a crack, and the familiar hum of the refrigerator echoed from the kitchen. The air felt thick, though heavy with something I couldn't explain. But then, I noticed something. The clock had moved. It wasn't just the hands spinning in reverse anymore. The face of the clock was slightly askew, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible crack running down the glass. It wasn't there before. I had checked it earlier, and everything had seemed fine. But now, it was different. I approached the clock cautiously, my eyes fixed on the crack, and reached out to touch it. The glass was cool to the touch, but as my fingers brushed against it, a shiver ran down my spine. I pulled my hand back, feeling as though I had just touched something alive. The ticking grew louder, sharper, as though it was vibrating through the very walls of the room. Suddenly, I heard something. A soft scuffling noise, like footsteps in the other room. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. No one was there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It must have been the stress, the fear. The clock, the strange events, the whispers. I was just overwhelmed. But then I heard it again. A faint scrape, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just my imagination. Someone, or something, was in the house. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from the table, and crept toward the hallway. Every step was agonizingly slow, my ears straining to catch any sound, but the house remained unnervingly quiet. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, and I could feel my skin prickling, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached the hallway, my eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and from behind it, I could just make out the faint sound of breathing. Someone was in my bedroom. I gripped the book tighter, my fingers growing numb. My mind raced, but I couldn't think clearly. The ticking of the clock was louder now, almost deafening, as if it was trying to drown out everything else. I felt its pull, a constant reminder that time was moving backward, that something was wrong, that something was coming for me. I took a step forward, and the door to the bedroom creaked slightly. The sound seemed to echo in the silence, drawing my attention even more. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. I pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make a sound. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. But I could still make out the shape of something in the corner of the room, just beyond the bed. It was a figure, sitting still, its back turned toward me. I froze, the book still clutched in my hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same figure from before, the one I had seen in the reflection. But now, it was sitting motionless in the room, as if waiting for me. I took a step back, my mind reeling. What was happening? Why was it here? And why was it always watching me? The figure didn't move. It didn't acknowledge me. But I could feel its presence, its dark energy, pressing in from all sides. The air felt colder now, the darkness in the room heavier, more oppressive. And then it spoke. Time is fragile, it whispered, its voice soft but chilling. You can't control it. It controls you. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. The figure turned its head slowly, its eyes locking onto mine. They were empty, hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in all light, all hope. You shouldn't have touched the clock, it continued, its voice a low rasp. You've changed things. And now, there's no going back. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor. The figure remained still, its gaze never leaving me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The clock's ticking was unbearable now, like a drumbeat in my head. Each tick, each backward movement of time, seemed to be erasing everything around me, unraveling the very fabric of reality. The figure rose, its movements slow and deliberate, its feet silent on the floor. It took a step toward me, and I flinched. My chest tightened, and the world seemed to warp around me once more. You're running out of time, it whispered. And when the clock stops, you'll be lost. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the words, but they lingered, echoing in my mind like a curse. I could feel the seconds slipping away, and in that moment, I understood. Time was no longer just a measurement of hours and minutes. It was something alive, something that could twist and bend, and now it was going to consume me. And as I opened my eyes again, I saw the figure standing directly in front of me, its cold hand reaching toward me. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The figure's hand hovered inches from my face, its cold presence overwhelming. It seemed to stretch the space between us, as though it was manipulating the air itself, bending it to its will. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in, pressing against my chest. I tried to scream, to shout, but the sound was trapped inside me, muffled by the growing pressure of the darkness around us. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice low and smooth, like the rustle of dead leaves in the wind. You don't understand yet, do you? It whispered, its words seeping into my mind. You think you're controlling time, but time is controlling you. You've unwittingly opened a door, and now there's no turning back. I could feel its hand, now inches from my face, the air around it chilling, biting like ice. My skin prickled with dread, and the darkness seemed to swirl around us, like ink in water, as if the world itself was unraveling. I tried to back away, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed, unable to escape the grip of the presence that loomed before me. The ticking of the clock was louder now, each tick a deafening reminder that time was slipping away. The figure tilted its head, studying me with those empty, hollow eyes. There was something so unnatural about its gaze, something that made me feel like I was being pulled into a void, a place where nothing made sense, where the rules of reality no longer applied. Time isn't linear, it continued, its voice growing darker. It's cyclical. And you are trapped in its loop now. You've undone the fabric of reality, and there's no way out. I felt a jolt of panic. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the madness that was unfolding around me. Was this a dream? Was this real? Had I really changed time by simply buying that damn clock? The figure's hand began to inch closer to me, its fingers twitching slightly as if it could feel my fear. I wanted to run, to get away, but my body was no longer my own. I couldn't move. The clock continued to tick behind me, louder now, each backward motion of the hands a sharp, painful reminder that I had lost control. Suddenly, the figure stepped back, its dark eyes never leaving mine. It seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to understand, to grasp the terrible truth. "You should never have looked back," it murmured, almost to itself. "Time is fragile, and once you've seen the past, you can never unsee it. You're part of it now, a part of the cycle. You can never move forward again." With a swift motion, it turned and walked toward the far wall. I could hear the floor creaking beneath its weight, but there was no sound of footsteps, just the soft shifting of air. It reached the wall and pressed a hand against it, the fingers splaying wide, as if it was merging with the darkness itself. The air around me felt thick, like it was alive, pulsating with energy. I could see the edges of reality fraying, like the threads of a broken tapestry, coming undone. Then, as if the world had shifted on its axis, I was no longer in my bedroom. I was in the hallway. The door to the living room stood open, and I could see the clock on the mantel, ticking backward, its hands spinning wildly, faster than I could follow. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, the walls damp and cracked. The entire house felt wrong, like I had stepped into a place that was not supposed to exist. The figure was gone, but I could feel its presence in the air, its shadow lurking just out of sight. I stepped forward, my legs shaky beneath me, and the house seemed to echo with every movement I made. I could hear whispers now, soft and distant, like voices coming from nowhere. They were faint at first, but they grew louder until they were unmistakable. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, speaking, warning me. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding, and the clock was still ticking, still spinning backward. But now, I noticed something different. The hands weren't just moving in reverse, they were shifting, changing, warping. The time on the clock no longer made sense. Hours were lost, days were skipped, and with every tick, my memories seemed to blur, to fade. The room around me seemed to flicker, like a broken television screen. One moment it was my living room, and the next, it was a strange, unfamiliar space, dark and twisted, with shadowy figures in the corners, watching, waiting. I turned, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, just beyond the shadows. It was me. My own reflection, standing motionless, staring back at me with hollow eyes. My heart stopped, my breath caught in my throat. How was this possible? How could it be me? The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. It opened its mouth, and its voice, my voice, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have bought the clock," it whispered, its tone a distorted version of my own. "Now, we're both trapped." I stood frozen, staring at the figure that looked so much like me. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow, and the expression on its face was nothing like mine, empty, devoid of any emotion, as though it was simply a reflection of something lost. The air felt thick with tension, suffocating me, and the whisper of the clock's ticking filled the room, relentless and growing louder. My own voice, distorted and chilling, echoed in my ears. "Now, we're both trapped." I took a hesitant step backward, my feet heavy, unwilling to move. My reflection, no, not a reflection, stepped forward too, matching my every move. Each time I moved, it mirrored me with horrifying accuracy, and yet there was something wrong. Its movements were jagged, mechanical, like it wasn't fully a part of this world. "Why?" I finally managed to croak, my throat dry. "Why are you here?" The figure's lips twisted into a mockery of a smile, but it didn't reach its eyes. "You opened the door," it replied, its voice so similar to mine that it sent a chill down my spine. You thought you could control time, but time controls you. You'll see. You'll learn. I wanted to run. I had to run. But my feet wouldn't cooperate. The floor beneath me felt slippery, like I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. The walls seemed to close in, shrinking around me, and the clock on the wall continued its unceasing, unnerving ticking. It was as if the sound was pulling at the very fabric of reality, warping everything around me. The figure inched closer, its steps eerily quiet. Every tick brings you further back, it said. You've seen the past, and now you'll live it. Over and over again. Time doesn't move forward for you anymore. You'll never escape. The words hit me like a wave, crashing over my mind. Was it true? Was this what had been happening all along? My life, slipping backward, leaving me more and more unsure of what was real? I looked at my reflection, or what was supposed to be my reflection, and I saw it. For the first time, I could see that it wasn't just mimicking me. There was something in its eyes, something that wasn't me. A cold, empty darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And I realized then, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that whatever this thing was, it was not a reflection. It was a part of the loop. A shadow of the past that had been created by my obsession with the clock. I stepped back again, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. No. I don't want this. I didn't mean it. Please. But the figure didn't stop. It came closer, and the closer it got, the more the room seemed to distort. The air was thick now, a dense fog that clouded my vision. The ticking of the clock was deafening, pounding in my skull. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the clock's hands spun in a frenzy, faster than ever before, as if they were about to shatter the very concept of time. The room was spinning, bending in on itself. I felt as though I was being sucked into the vortex that was unfolding in front of me. My body lurched forward, and before I could make sense of it, I was somewhere else. I was back in my bedroom. The clock sat on the mantel, its hands still moving backward, but the room felt different. It wasn't the same as before. The air was still thick with a sense of dread, but there was no figure now, no twisted reflection. Everything was eerily still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted. I glanced at the clock, and for a split second, I thought I saw my reflection in its glass face. No, not my reflection. A shadow. I turned quickly, scanning the room. The house was silent, too silent. No sound of my footsteps, no ticking from the clock, just an oppressive stillness. I reached for the clock, my fingers trembling. I needed to stop it. I had to stop the loop. But as soon as my fingers touched the glass, I felt a sharp jolt run through me. My body froze, and I was hit with a rush of images, flashes of moments I hadn't lived yet, or had I? Moments that stretched backward in time, memories that didn't belong to me. My heart raced as the images grew clearer, my own face, twisted in the reflection, its eyes cold and empty, staring back at me, repeating the words, "You've opened the door." I yanked my hand away from the clock, panting. I looked around, but there was no escaping the feeling that I was not alone. That the thing, the figure, was still watching me, waiting, just out of sight, lurking in the corners of my mind. The clock kept ticking, its hands spinning backward faster and faster, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just time that was being rewound. It was me. I had become part of the cycle. There was no way out. And as the ticking grew louder, I understood. Time didn't move in a straight line. It was a loop, a cycle of endless repetition. Every time I tried to escape, I was pulled back in. There was no forward anymore. Only the past, forever repeating until I was nothing more than a shadow, just like the figure. And in the end, it wasn't the clock that controlled me. It was time itself. Have you ever wondered if a picture could capture something more than just a moment in time? What if it could take something, someone, away? I never believed in superstitions or magic. I was a skeptic, a person who found comfort in logic and reason. But that was before I got my hands on the old camera. The one I bought from that strange little shop on the corner. It looked ordinary enough, nothing special, just an old film camera with a worn leather strap. The storekeeper had given it to me with a strange warning, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just a gimmick to sell a useless item. I didn't know then that the camera would change everything. It started with a simple photo. My friends and I were at a park on a crisp autumn day, laughing and talking, enjoying the kind of afternoon that makes you forget about the world. I pulled out the camera, eager to capture the moment, to freeze the joy in time. The picture came out well. Everyone looked happy, smiling wide, carefree. But when I looked at the photo later, something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, just a strange blur in the corner of the image. But as I studied it, I realized it wasn't a blur at all. It was the faint outline of someone who wasn't there. A shadow, a figure that wasn't part of the group. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine as I stared at the photo. But I shrugged it off. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. After all, old cameras sometimes had strange quirks. The next day, my friend Natalie vanished. At first, we all thought she had just gone somewhere, maybe a spontaneous trip, or perhaps she was avoiding us. But as the hours stretched on, the truth sank in. Natalie was gone. No phone calls, no messages, no sign of her anywhere. Then, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I pulled out the photo from the day before, the one with the strange figure in the corner. I looked at it again, this time with a cold, sinking feeling. The figure wasn't just a shadow, it was her. Natalie. But now, she was missing from the photo, just like she was from the world. I couldn't believe it. How could this be? I looked at the camera in my hands. It was the only thing that connected me to the strange disappearance. That photo, the moment that now felt cursed, was the last time any of us had seen her. It was as if the camera had stolen her, wiped her from existence, and left nothing but a photograph. I had to know more. I couldn't live with the fear and confusion gnawing at me. So, I began to investigate. I dug through the old photo album where I kept all my photos. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. It wasn't just Natalie. The next photo, taken weeks before, showed another of my friends, Mark, standing next to me with a wide grin. But when I looked closely at the photo, I saw that Mark wasn't there anymore. Not in the image, not anywhere. I felt sick. Mark had disappeared the same day as the photo was taken, but it wasn't just that he was gone in real life, he was gone in the photograph too. It was as if the camera erased them both, as if it was a silent witness to their vanishings. The thought of it made my head spin. What kind of camera was this? What had I unleashed when I snapped that first photo? Was it the camera that took them, or was it something darker, something that existed outside of time and space that had been triggered by my use of it? With my heart pounding, I decided to test it. I took another photo, this time of my living room, hoping it was all just a coincidence, some sort of twisted trick of the light. I clicked the shutter, and the camera made its usual software. When I checked the photo, my stomach dropped. The photo was blurry, but there was no mistaking it. A figure, tall and dark, was standing in the corner of the room, just behind the couch. It was only half visible, as though it was trying to remain hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence in the picture, like an invasive force that had no place in the image. I could almost hear the sound of breathing behind me. Slowly, I turned around. The room was empty. My heart raced. I was alone in the room, but the figure in the photo seemed so real, too real. I didn't know what to do. Every photo I took, every moment I captured, seemed to twist reality more and more. It was as if I was opening a door I couldn't close, a door that led to something I wasn't supposed to understand. Something that had power over the past, the present, and the future. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Whatever this camera was, whatever dark force it had awakened, it wasn't just taking people from my life, it was erasing them from reality. I had to find out where they were going, and how to stop it before anyone else vanished. But that would mean going deeper, much deeper, into the mystery of the camera. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the horrors I might find on the other side. The more I thought about it, the more the reality of what I was dealing with sunk in. It wasn't just that people were disappearing. They were being erased, forgotten, as though they never existed in the first place. Not in photographs, not in memories, not in reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that the camera was tied to something far darker than I ever imagined. Each photo felt like a trigger, like each click of the shutter was a doorway being opened into a place I wasn't meant to enter. I decided to investigate the origins of the camera. There had to be a reason why it was doing this. I went back to the strange little shop where I had bought it, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. The shop was still there, tucked away between two old brick buildings, hidden in plain sight. The dimly lit interior smelled of dust and old paper. Shelves upon shelves of antique items lined the walls, each with its own story to tell, or perhaps, in some cases, its own curse. I walked to the counter, where the storekeeper stood, his pale, gaunt face looking more unsettling than I remembered. He glanced up as I entered, but this time there was something different about him. His eyes seemed empty, as if he knew something I didn't. "You came back," he said softly, his voice raspy. "I knew you would." I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced with questions. How could he have known? Did he know what was happening with the camera? "I need answers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What is this camera? Why is it doing this to my friends?" The storekeeper didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "It's not the camera," he said, almost too quietly to hear. "It's the curse it carries." "Cursed?" I repeated, feeling a cold chill creep down my spine. "What do you mean?" He paused, then reached for a dusty book from the shelf behind him. He opened it to a page covered in strange symbols and faded ink. "This camera," he began, "is no ordinary object. It's been passed down through generations, a relic of an old family. Each time it's used, it pulls the subject, the person in the photo, into another realm. A realm where time doesn't work the same way. It's a place between places, a shadowed dimension that doesn't follow the rules of our reality." I stared at him, struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "So, my friends are gone because of the camera?" Yes, he nodded, his voice solemn. But they're not gone for good. Not yet. The longer you continue to use the camera, the more its power will unravel the fabric of reality. It distorts everything around it. The people in the photos, they're trapped in the limbo between this world and the next. You have to stop using it before it consumes everything you know. I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just some weird coincidence. There was real danger here, and it was getting closer with every passing day. But how do I stop it? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. How do I get my friends back? The storekeeper's eyes darkened. You must destroy the camera. Only then will the cycle end. But how? How do I destroy something that doesn't seem to follow the laws of reality? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the book and looked at me with a mixture of pity and dread. There's a ritual, he said finally. It's an ancient one. But it's dangerous. It could destroy you too. You must be prepared to face whatever is on the other side of the camera. I didn't hesitate. I was already in too deep. I had to find a way to bring my friends back. I'll do it, I said, my voice shaking but resolute. I'll face whatever it takes. The storekeeper gave me a long, searching look. Then, with a resigned sigh, he handed me the book. Do it quickly, he warned. The longer you wait, the more powerful the camera becomes. And once it claims enough souls, there may be no way to stop it at all. I left the shop with the book in hand, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The camera was no longer just a curiosity, it was a curse. And if I didn't act soon, I feared it would take more than just my friends. It would take everything. I returned home, my hands trembling as I stared at the camera sitting on the table before me. I had to follow the ritual exactly as it was written. No room for error. I began reading the ancient text, my heart pounding in my chest. It was strange, foreign words and symbols that seemed to shift and move on the page. The instructions were cryptic, but one thing was clear, the ritual required a sacrifice. I had to make a choice. Could I really go through with this? Would it bring my friends back, or would it drag me into the very realm I was trying to escape? I wasn't sure. But as I stood there, staring at the camera, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker. And the ticking of the clock on the wall felt louder, more ominous than ever before. I spent the next few hours absorbed in the book, reading the strange symbols over and over again, trying to decipher their meaning. The more I read, the more I felt like the walls around me were closing in. The air in my room grew heavier, colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked at the camera, which sat ominously on the table, waiting. It seemed almost to mock me, its cold, lifeless surface reflecting the dim light of my room. The more I stared at it, the more I realized that this was my last chance. If I failed, there would be no turning back. The ritual required a precise set of actions, each step marked with an old incantation. I had to place the camera in a circle of salt, light 3 black candles around it, and then speak the words from the book aloud. But the hardest part was the sacrifice. The book didn't say what kind of sacrifice, only that it had to be something of great value, something that meant everything to me. I closed the book and stared at the camera. My heart raced, my mind spinning with possibilities. What would I have to give up? The sacrifice had to be something that tied me to this world, something that would sever my connection to the curse forever. My mind kept returning to my friends, the ones who had already vanished. I had seen their faces in the photos, their expressions fading, distorting as they were pulled into the darkness. I couldn't live with the guilt of losing them. If I could undo the damage, I had to. I grabbed the camera, feeling its weight in my hands. The cold metal seemed to pulse under my fingertips as though it had a life of its own. It had been with me since I'd found it in that strange shop, and now it felt like the only thing connecting me to the nightmare. I began to prepare the ritual as the book instructed. I poured the salt into a perfect circle on the floor, placing the camera in the center. I lit the 3 black candles, their flames flickering as I chanted the incantation, the words flowing from my lips, strange and ancient. The room grew colder still, the shadows lengthening, twisting into unnatural shapes. And then, as I spoke the final words, the room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The air felt charged, thick with something dark, something powerful. Suddenly, the camera shutter clicked on its own. I froze, heart in my throat. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. I turned, and there, standing in the darkness, was a figure. It was vague at first, just a shape, an outline, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the details. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend with the shadows. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. His presence was suffocating, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and with each step, the air grew colder. My heart pounded in my chest. The figure stopped just outside the circle of salt, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the figure spoke. "You cannot undo what has been done." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary man. He wasn't of this world. He was a part of the darkness that had been unleashed by the camera. "You've already made your choice," he continued, his voice like a soft hiss. "There is no turning back." I tried to speak, to protest, but no words came out. I felt paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as the figure moved closer, his presence suffocating the very air I breathed. And then, with a sudden movement, he reached out and touched the camera. A jolt of energy shot through the room, and the world around me began to distort. The walls seemed to twist and ripple like water, and the air grew heavy, thick with an otherworldly pressure. I heard the faintest sound, a whispering, as though thousands of voices were speaking at once, their words incomprehensible, but full of malice. The camera began to vibrate in my hands, its lens focusing and unfocusing on its own. A bright light exploded from it, blinding me. I fell to the ground, my body trembling, unable to move as the light enveloped me, pulling me into the darkness. In that moment, everything I had ever known, my life, my memories, my friends, began to slip away, as though they were never real. The edges of my consciousness blurred, and I felt myself being torn from this reality, falling into a place I could not understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I was lying on the floor, gasping for air, my heart racing. The candles were extinguished, the circle of salt broken. The room was silent, still. I looked around, my breath shallow. The figure was gone, and the camera lay on the floor beside me, lifeless. But something was different. The air felt wrong. The room seemed unfamiliar, even though it was the same. The photographs on the wall, my friends' faces, were now blank, their images erased. And the feeling of being watched, it was gone. Instead, there was an eerie emptiness, a vast silence that pressed in on me. I stood slowly, feeling dizzy and disoriented. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but it felt like everything had shifted. The room no longer felt like my home. It felt like a place I didn't belong. I grabbed the camera and held it up to my face, staring into the lens. For a moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, moving in the reflection. I wasn't sure if it was real, but deep down, I knew it was. Something had followed me back. I didn't want to believe it, but I could feel it, as if something unseen had latched onto me, following me, watching me from the shadows. It was almost as though the camera itself had opened a door to something far darker, something that had now slipped through and attached itself to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that reality was no longer the same. The room around me, though unchanged in appearance, felt distant, alien. It was as though the very air had thickened, like it was laden with an invisible weight. My body felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as if I was wading through something thick and suffocating. I turned to the photographs on the wall. The empty faces stared back at me, their once joyful expressions now completely blank, devoid of life. The faces of my friends, people I had known, loved, laughed with, now nothing but empty frames. I felt a tight knot in my chest. What had happened to them? They hadn't just vanished from the photos, they had vanished from my life. And if the photographs were to be believed, they hadn't existed at all, as if they had never been real in the first place. A sudden thought hit me, like a bolt of lightning. Had I been the one to disappear all along? Was it me who had been erased from the world? The camera. It was still in my hand, but now it felt different. Cold, like an object that had taken on a life of its own. I stared at it for what felt like hours, contemplating my next move. The book had warned me about the portal, the place beyond the lens. But I hadn't understood then. The dark figure, the whispers, the oppressive air, it was all tied to this cursed object. The camera wasn't just a tool, it was a key. A key to something far worse than I could have ever imagined. I set the camera down on the table, determined to find out more. The book had told me the portal would close, but it would only close if the proper steps were taken. But nothing had been normal since I first picked up that camera. What did I have to do to stop it? Could I even stop it? A knock on the door. My heart stopped. I froze. No one had knocked on my door in days. No one had even come by to check on me. Who could it be? I moved cautiously towards the door, dread crawling up my spine. Another knock, this one louder. It echoed in the silence of the room. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, the door swung open on its own. There was no one standing outside. A rush of cold air swept into the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. I stepped back, my pulse racing. The door hadn't opened by itself. This was no accident. Someone, or something, had opened it. I closed the door quickly and locked it, trying to steady my breathing. But as soon as I did, I heard it, a faint, distant clicking sound. It was coming from the direction of the camera. Slowly, I turned. The camera was no longer where I had left it. It was now lying on the floor, its lens staring at me. The clicking grew louder. It was coming from the camera. I hesitated for a moment before stepping toward it, my feet feeling like they were made of stone. The clicking was rhythmic, almost deliberate. And then I saw it. On the lens, something was moving. It was a shadow, a figure. Just a blur at first, but as I focused, the figure became clearer. It was a person. Or, at least it looked like a person. But something was wrong. The figure had no face, no features. It was just a dark, shifting silhouette. I reached out, drawn to it despite the fear clawing at my chest. As my hand got closer to the camera, the shadow grew larger, its shape becoming more defined, more solid. And then, suddenly, the shadow leaped from the lens. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, as the figure, no, the creature, emerged from the camera like some twisted version of reality. It was no longer a blur, it was a person now, but one that was bent and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, its body distorting in ways that defied logic. It moved toward me with unnatural speed, its empty, dark eyes locked on mine. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The creature moved faster, its feet making no sound against the floor. It was closing the distance between us, and I had nowhere to run. I scrambled to my feet, but the figure was right behind me, its breath hot against the back of my neck. I turned, and as I did, the world seemed to collapse around me. The walls were closing in, the air growing thicker. The creature reached out, its hand grasping for me, but I managed to dodge its grasp. In a moment of pure panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the camera. Without a second thought, I raised it and took a photo. The flash was blinding, and in that split second, the creature froze. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The figure stood there, completely still, like a statue. Then, slowly, it began to fade. Its edges became blurry, its shape losing definition. And before I could react, it vanished, disappearing into nothingness. The room was still. The air was normal again. The suffocating pressure was gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the spot where the creature had been. The camera. I looked down at it in my hands. It was silent now, no clicking, no flickering shadows. I didn't know what I had just done, but I knew one thing for sure, I had barely escaped. And even though the creature was gone, the feeling remained. This wasn't over. I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. The air, though lighter, still felt off, as if the weight of something had settled in, something that wouldn't easily leave. The camera in my hands felt like an anchor, too heavy, too dangerous, too linked to everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its twisted, contorted form, its faceless stare. I dropped the camera onto the table, almost as if it had burned me. It was quiet now. Too quiet. The once familiar sounds of the world outside seemed distant, muted. The low hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of birds outside, everything had dulled, like I was living in a dream or some in-between place. For a long while, I stood motionless, trying to gather my thoughts. But the questions kept swirling in my mind. What had I just encountered? Was it real, or was it a product of the camera's twisted magic? And more importantly, what had happened to my friends? They had been erased from the photos, and with each disappearance, it felt like I was losing more of them. More of reality itself. I reached for the camera again, almost against my will, but as my fingers brushed its cold surface, I hesitated. The memory of the creature, of how it had moved, of the way the world seemed to bend when it appeared, everything was starting to blur together. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, jolting me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it, desperate for some kind of distraction, some kind of connection to the world outside. The screen lit up with a message. It was from Emily. I need to see you. I know you're in danger. I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily. She was one of the ones who had disappeared in the photos. I had seen her face vanish, pixel by pixel, her smile fading into nothingness. The message had to be some kind of trick. But it felt real. Too real. I typed a quick reply, my hands shaking. How do you know? What happened to you? The reply came almost instantly. I can't explain, but I know you're still using the camera. You don't understand what it does, but I do. It isn't just taking people, it's taking pieces of time, pieces of reality. And the more you use it, the more you erase. I read her message over and over, the weight of her words sinking in. Where are you? I typed back, heart racing. The reply was a single line. The place where it all began. I knew exactly where she meant. The old photography studio, the one we had visited together when we were younger. I hadn't thought about it in years. But now, everything felt tied to that place, that moment in time. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed the camera, its presence now almost suffocating, and left the apartment. The streets were eerily quiet. It was as if everyone had just stopped moving. Cars were parked on the side of the road, but no one was in them. Shop windows displayed empty aisles, lifeless mannequins standing frozen in time. The world had lost its rhythm, its pulse. And I was running through it, as though I was the only one left. When I reached the photography studio, the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I pushed it open, the old bell above the door jingling softly as I stepped inside. The place hadn't changed much since we were kids. The same dusty shelves, the same old cameras and frames lining the walls. But the air felt different now. It was thick, oppressive, and the silence felt deeper here, as though the room itself was holding its breath. And then I saw her. Emily. She was standing near the back of the studio, her back to me. But something was wrong. Her figure was flickering, like an old film reel skipping, her body becoming translucent with each blink. Emily? I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine. But they weren't the same eyes I remembered. They were hollow, dark, and empty. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale, like the life had been drained from her. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice hollow, distant. It's too late. I took a step toward her, but she raised her hand, as if to stop me. Don't use the camera anymore. You don't know what you're dealing with, she said, her voice trembling. It doesn't just take people. It takes time. It rewrites everything. It erases memories. It changes the world itself. My heart was racing. What are you talking about? Emily's expression twisted with pain. You're already fading. You think you're still here, but you're not. Every time you use that camera, you lose a part of yourself. A part of your reality. Her voice grew weaker, her figure flickering more rapidly. And the more you try to fix it, the worse it gets. You can't fight it. It will consume you. Suddenly, the camera in my hand began to shake. I felt the cold metal vibrate, like it was alive, pulling me toward it. I couldn't resist. I raised it, and as I did, Emily's figure flickered one last time, her face frozen in terror. With a flash, everything went black. I woke up in my apartment. The world was still, but it felt different. The air was still thick, oppressive. I glanced around. The camera was gone, but something had changed. The walls, the furniture, everything was the same, but it wasn't. The more I looked, the more I realized the people in the photos were no longer missing. They were all there again, as if nothing had ever happened. But there was something wrong. Their eyes, empty, lifeless. They weren't the same. And I wasn't the same either. I wasn't sure what I had done, but I knew one thing: the camera had claimed me, too. And as I stood there, I understood with a sinking feeling in my chest, the camera wasn't just a tool. It was the keeper of reality, and I had just rewritten it. Now, I was a part of the disappearance too. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.